Great. So recording has started now. So again, welcome to Dome Workshops. Why do we fight about politics, religion, and everything else? So when we're talking about fighting, we can kind of have this image of, say, the dreaded awkward family dinner where different people are arguing, especially over politics and religion. But there are lots of other hot topics as well. But what do you think, like for you guys, have you guys ever had this kind of experience where you've gotten into fights either with family members or with coworkers? And what were those fights about? Anyone can just unmute themselves and say, or you can also write into the chat. So what are some of the reasons we get into these like awkward fights?
Yeah, I don't mind volunteering. So definitely over dinner with the family growing up, we were divided in terms of faith within the house. So there were definitely conversations at time about where we stood on those things and why somebody's views didn't make sense to somebody else, or why they disagreed with them, or whatever else, getting down into the details of that.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yeah. So we can fight over faith and religion. What are some other concrete issues that kind of get us into these awkward fights?
Child rearing opinions and ideas often come up.
Does it get vicious?
Maybe.
I also recently had discussions about COVID and the treatment therapeutics.
So the treatment or the vaccine or?
Oh yes, all treatment and vaccine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So how? Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Patty. Anyone else?
I've recently gotten. I'll just say quickly. I've recently gotten into conflicts with friends about race and gender. They haven't been as intense and heated. I wouldn't really call them fights necessarily, thankfully, but definitely large disagreements with people whom I otherwise strongly agree on pretty much every other topic.
Perfect. Thanks, Danilo. Somebody else was speaking as well. Wanted to add something?
I've seen great sensitivity arise around veganism and what we should or should not eat.
Consumption in a literal sense, but it could be a little bit more. Great. Thanks, Angela.
I've gotten into fights over which political party you support.
Sometimes over different interpretations of the same event.
Like something in the news, you mean? Or like history?
Or even something more personal that two people were there for, and their interpretation of what happened is very different.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, is there a category for teenagers who just like to fight for the sake of fighting?
I think sometimes they're just called teenagers. But that's, yeah, I feel like that's going to be that's a separate issue. We'll be talking about something a little bit more yeah, a little more manageable in one sense.
I could throw, that's funny. I could throw safety, just questions around safety of doing certain things, traveling in certain places, or taking certain types of transportation.
Like physical safety, you mean?
Yes.
Great. Because also I think a lot about safety, because safety is a big buzzword right now when we think about safe spaces, when we think about also debates around free speech and what kinds of words do we use, do we not use. This could be a very contentious topic. I'm going to add safe space. I'm going to add free speech. Yeah, this is a great list. So one thing that's common with a lot of these is that some of you guys might have gotten into kind of minor fights about this, but I think all of us have seen, especially online, that these can descend very easily into different flame wars. People can protest about these, people can stop talking to their family members, to their friends. Like disputes over things like this can have a lot of very intense consequences. So what I wanted to kind of talk about today is what are some of the reasons why people fight over these issues, and not just fight, but why is this something that's so passionate, and so why does it generate such a huge response, especially now? So thank you for this. So again, we're going to be focusing on what might be some of the reasons why these people in these kinds of fights can be reacting so differently, so passionately, or even sometimes so hostilely. What do you guys think? Why are these so contentious?
I feel like often when people react passionately, it's because they feel like there is something that needs defending. So whether that's something that's threatened for them or for other people they care about, or something else they care about.
Mm-hmm. There's a sense of threat, maybe a sense of something's at stake.
Yeah.
I also feel that there's more obvious polarity being presented, like in the news or in common topics of discussion. So it's not so much a continuum of ideas that are being presented or people are getting behind, but real extremes in viewpoints.
Could we phrase that as like either or thinking, in a sense, like either this or that, like very little middle ground? Does that make sense? Or not even thinking, but frameworks. So something like you're with this or you're against this, and so nuance can be kind of lost. So again, this kind of leads to something being at stake. David.
The thing I've noticed is someone will lose, I'll be debating an ideal, this kind of abstract thing separate from us in the conversation. And the person I'm speaking to seems to not be debating an ideal, but like, it's like I'm debating them. So they can't separate themselves from the ideal. And yeah, it helps to recognize when that's happening.
Yeah, so I'm going to put down taking things personally. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. Or the personal element. It's not just about the ideas. Something that's connected to us, and we'll be talking a bit more about that today. Angela?
Yeah, I think that when the things are connected to people's identity or their values, and these are two different things, but then I think they react in vehement kind of ways. So if you identify yourself as a steak eating healthy man, and then I say, oh, all good people on the planet are vegan, then you feel very attacked.
Yeah, so a sense of personal attack. So
yeah,
which is similar to personal element, but yeah, so it's about more than just these ideas. Great. Lisa?
I think sometimes people respond to things on an emotional level, and all logic goes out the window.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that people talk about, the relationship between emotion and logic. Some people kind of frame it as like rationality, irrationality. For me, sometimes that kind of language can easily lead to kind of dismissing certain people, like, oh, you're just being emotional, or you're being irrational. That can also kind of be something that triggers people. If I kind of frame myself as the logical one and I frame the other as the irrational one, sometimes people dig in even deeper. So there's also that kind of dynamic. Matthew? Matthew, your hand was up.
I clicked on the wrong button there. Yeah, so a lot of times people act very passionately because they think there's a deeply held or deeply important moral principle that's being violated or threatened by the other person.
Fantastic. Great. Any other, maybe we'll just take one more person. Greg.
Yeah, sometimes I think it could just be like our innate desire to be right and to satisfy our ego. and be seen to be right and correct and virtuous in front of other people, I guess, or to have that sort of moment, mic drop moment, whatever.
Yeah, so so ego, I think, could be something that's huge. Also, like a desire to win.
Yeah, exactly.
Can also be a thing. And when you mention kind of appearing in a certain way, status and saving face can also be an issue. Because especially if it's a high stakes kind of thing, and you don't want to be seen as wrong or worse, a bad person.
Yeah, sure.
Definitely. Great. So Joanne was personalizing, she said in the chat, and pride. Sharon says an inability to let two answers be equally valuable and correct, the need for a winner. Yeah, so kind of a sense of competition or zero-sum thinking, where it's like, again, this is this kind of either or framework where it's hard to believe that both people can be right in certain contexts, or maybe there might be some times where this is important and sometimes where that is important. So yeah, these are all very great answers, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that today, and also about kind of the theories why these things affect us so much. What is it about us that makes us so vulnerable to these kinds of reasons, and also maybe what we can do about it. So are these kinds of fights a problem, right? Because sometimes it depends on who we are and who we're discussing things with. Sometimes these are kind of friendly debates. Sometimes it's very easy for us to agree to disagree, even about something that's fairly controversial. But there's actually kind of a bigger social problem that's happening right now. There's a lot of research out there that's saying that more people view political others or ideological others, people who believe different things about these topics, to be like a danger to the culture or a danger to society, for example. We have more fights between friends, coworkers, family members, online groups, and larger communities, and that can spill out and affect people's mental health. Another finding that in the research that's been really interesting is that ideological differences over these kinds of issues right now are a bigger divide in North American culture, at least. I'm not sure how it is in other places, but ideology is a bigger divide than other markers like race, class, and culture. And that doesn't mean that that the impact is as big. So, for example, the racial discrimination or gender discrimination, these are still huge things, and the effects of that might still be felt. But if a person is much more likely to look at another with hostility if they're a political other, rather than a person of another race, a culture, or religion. And that's something I found very fascinating, because we talk a lot about discrimination in one way, or hostility in these kind of traditional ways, but actually this is a new kind of divide that's being noticed by researchers. And so one bit that I found interesting, this was a research bit from the American case. So they were looking at Republicans and Democrats. So 35% of Republicans and 45% of Democrats don't want their kids marrying into the other side. And so this is kind of, people are wondering if these are signs that not only of disagreement, but of increasing dehumanization. So again, not just seeing the other as wrong, but the other as possibly bad or problematic or even evil, depending on what language you use. And so these are kind of some of the issues that are coming up around these issues. And so that's why we're kind of focusing on that. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen different metaphors using icebergs. So some of our previous workshops, we talked about different techniques for resolving conflict. So for those of us who are here for the past two, one on a technique called double crux and another called nonviolent communication. This double crux is about how do we figure out with our positions. We state different positions, how do we resolve our differences of positions? This nonviolent communication was about needs and unmet needs. So how is the fact that I feel visible or not, or I feel safe or not? How can that affect whether we're in conflict or not? But today we're going to be going a little further down into the iceberg. We're going to be looking at different cognitive aspects, the unconscious things we may not, that just make us react, basically, in certain ways. So for the first, we're going to divide, like the presentation is going to be divided into two sections. The first is about some of the cognitive reasons why we react so strongly. And the second part is going to be about two factors that are really important now that influence whether or not we get triggered in this way. Any questions so far?
So would this part kind of be like the shipwreck under the iceberg?
It could, like, I hope there's no shipwreck. I don't know, some submarine crashes in, definitely. David.
How do you know that this is the way things work? Because you're mentioning research.
Yep.
Yeah.
So which element in particular were you curious about?
What we'll be talking today, I guess, if we want to keep it on topic, because you're saying you know, these things happen for these reasons.
Yeah. So
yeah, so how do you know that these are the reasons why?
So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to like get all of the different, like I can't say all the sources, but I'm actually a master's student in conflict studies right now. And so as part of the program, we're actually kind of reading a lot of the science behind a lot of this stuff. And I'm going to be mentioning some of the books that collect some of this research. And if you're interested in any particular aspect, you can follow up with me and I can give you some more kind of concrete research. Oh, can you guys hear me now? Hello?
You're back, I think.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you seem good.
Yeah.
We didn't catch any of that, just, you know.
Okay.
We lost you after you said you are a master's student in conflict study, so everything after that.
Okay, great. If I do cut out, feel free to send a message into the chat so I know immediately. Hopefully our internet is fine. But yeah, so over the course of our program, we're actually reading a lot of the research that talks about this stuff. And I'll be mentioning some of that research as we talk about different points. And so if you're interested in a particular element of that, let me know. Also, we'll have discussion at the end. So we'll have a bit more time to talk about the particulars. But these are things that people, both academics, but also conflict resolution specialists have been talking about for decades. There's some research that's newer, and we'll talk, but some of this stuff is quite, like, it's in the field. Does that, I'm not sure if that answers your question. Like it doesn't give you any concrete stuff, but.
No, but I'll keep an eye out as things go along.
Perfect. So yeah, also, if anybody sees a claim that they think is far-fetched, write it down and let me know, and we can talk about that. Because there's going to be a lot of information today, like I'm not going to have time to say this comes from that, but if there is a certain issue, then we can talk about it either in the discussion or even follow up after the meeting. So thanks David for bringing that up. Any other questions? Great. Also, something might be presented from the research. You might disagree, and that's okay. I think if nothing else, my hope today is that we talk about some of the basically the discourse, the conversation that's happening around why these things affect us in these specific ways, and using that knowledge, or using at least those kinds of, like, that kind of discussion, we can orient ourselves in a certain way to the fights that maybe we observe or that we want to change or challenge. So again, there's hopefully going to be a lot of room for discussion at the end. So anything else before we continue? Great. So the first section, people have a lot going on under the hood. So we're going to be talking a bit about the cognitive issues of why some of us react in certain ways, right? Like when we're confronted with certain issues. So I want to talk about a theory that was promoted in a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And so he won the Nobel Prize for economics. It's not the Nobel Prize, but the Nobel Memorial Prize, something like this. And so he's a behavioral economist. And he popularized a theory that there are two different kinds of thinking in our heads. So one's called system 1 and one's called system 2. A lot of you guys have probably heard this before. System 1, this is kind of more reactive, unconscious, fast kind of thinking. This is the fast element of the thinking fast and slow. And so system 2, he claims, is more deliberative, it's conscious and slow. So they say that we evolve these two different kinds of, these two different ways of thinking because they serve different functions as we kind of evolved and as we kind of grew up, like hunter-gatherers. Like when we're under threat, this is where system one kicks in, this fight or flight kind of response. Like we don't want to get eaten, you know, like if something comes up, so we have to act very quickly. But this is reactive in the sense that it might not be as entirely felt through. Tess is saying the worst named concepts in psychology. Do you know if there are other names for this?
Pretty sure A and B thinking, but that's not much better.
No, there's no other names, but like it's just so terrible, and it makes it difficult for people to learn them and remember them, because like system 1 and system 2, seriously. But
yeah, so I guess like I think that's why the book title is really great. So like we're gonna call it more fast thinking and slow thinking in a way, or deliberative thinking and reactive thinking. So there's a lot of reptilian brain, these kinds of things. Yeah, those are all kind of talking about this kind of system, right? Where basically we go into a kind of like mental lockdown mode when we're faced with certain things, when we need to make certain choices. And it's not that one way of thinking is better than the other. They both serve a certain kind of function. But in the same way that perhaps in the past, we needed to eat a lot of things to survive, but now, like when we eat lots of things, we become unhealthy. When we have these different types of thinking in our world today, it might not be as helpful as it was in the past. So, so the difference between this kind of deliberative thinking and reactive thinking is something that can be quite important. And it's often when we think about something called triggers. And so trigger, this was a word that's kind of like, it was in vogue a few years ago, especially people talked about trigger warnings, things like this. Some people have a lot of different kind of feelings and opinions towards that. I just want to use trigger in the sense that it's something that shifts our thinking from deliberative to reactive. So some kind of, it could be some kind of threats. It could be a perceived threat, you know, it might not be an actual, like it might not put us in actual danger, but if we think that we're in danger or if we think that we're unsafe, we might switch over into this fast thinking. And that's usually in some ways because our brain thinks that we need to defend ourselves. So again, this is something that protects us. And that's, we don't want to kind of demonize that system, because I think also, especially in conflict resolution, there can be this, like, at least in that field, I've seen a lot of people that kind of disparage this fast kind of thinking, saying that it's reactive and it's not smart enough, but it's about taking care of ourselves. So what might be some of the triggers for the fights that we talked about above? So what are some of the things that might be triggering people about these particular issues?
Radio, news and radio. Oh, for COVID and treatment vaccines over and over and over again, having the news being blasted, the same thing over and over again.
Okay, so this kind of repetition, this feeling that something's being pushed to us. Okay, David?
I think a concern, maybe not even realizing it, but of worrying about being socially ostracized and being cast out from their social circle.
Absolutely. Yeah. So some people might be afraid of maybe saying their opinions because they're afraid of this kind of thing. Or maybe some people will say what other people are saying in order to not also be rejected from your group. That can be a thing. Sharon?
My main reaction to this was like, it's about fear, like either fear that a message is not being portrayed correctly, or you will be, or like there's something at stake and there's a fear. And so that makes it more immediate and like you have to correct the person in the moment because there's something at stake.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I really actually like that phrase. Like whenever somebody's being triggered, whenever we're getting involved in these fights, it's because we think something important is at stake. And so whenever we come across somebody who's reacting in a strong way, maybe in a way that we don't understand, that's a sign that this person thinks that something's at stake and that something needs to be defended. So going back down to these. And a part of this is that a lot of these issues are actually very complicated. So actually, I'll go back up for a second again. So a lot of these issues are like very multidimensional, very complex. They affect people in very different ways. We talk about child rearing, right? Disputes over how to be with children, right? How to prepare them for life. What does it mean to have safe spaces? You know, like what is the need for safety? When we're talking about COVID and the vaccine, like a lot of these debates are about the safety of others. Some people phrase their concerns in terms of body autonomy. You know, they don't want, like they want to have a certain freedom over what goes in it or out of their body. Some people want to be protected from being infected. So these are all, there's lots of different needs that are involved here. So if we go back to the iceberg, there's different positions that are informed by different needs. And one consequence of what happens when we're triggered and kind of go into this fast thinking is that we start putting blinders on. So a lot of us have kind of seen, have heard of this story of the elephant. It's often in the context of religion, where there's an elephant and there's lots of people with blindfolds, and each person touches a different part of the elephant, and they think that like the trunk is a snake, or the tail is like a tree, or like, you know what I mean? And so one metaphor that I've heard about why some of these fights get so intense and so protracted, because some of these fights have been happening for decades. Especially if we talk about North America, like debates over religion, debates over moral issues like abortion, all of these different things have been going on for a long time, because different people see different things in them. Sometimes some people see the concerns of one group, some people can see the concerns of another group, and it's hard to kind of see the whole picture and to kind of look at different things with nuance. So what are some what do you guys think of that metaphor? Is that something that resonates? Have you ever seen somebody who seems to have blinders on, who can't see something that to you is really obvious? And maybe you think that, oh, if they only saw this, this fight might not happen, or it might happen differently. Have you ever had that kind of experience?
There was that documentary about social media, and how the more social media you watch about this with the same circle of people, the more narrow your view gets and the more you hear the message you want to hear. So I have people in my Facebook who I, before COVID, would think would be like reacting differently to things than they are. And I think it's because of the information we're all getting such like narrow information, and we're getting so much of it, we're so convicted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the word that some people are using for this is called echo chambers, where basically we surround ourselves by people who say similar things. And this also creates kind of like it's a blinder that happens not only because we're being triggered, but because we're forming communities that also kind of believes the same things that we do. Any other thoughts? Has anyone else been in a situation where it seems like there was a blinder up?
Maybe like a few times just in class. Trying to think. There was a gentleman in my. I'm doing a master's in, but just finished a master's in counseling. So one of the counselors, a gentleman from the Middle East, who wanted to raise the conversation in class about corporal punishment and like how we would deal with like discerning the difference between corporal punishment and child abuse in therapy. And it was completely shot down. Like there was no openness to debate, to conversing about this. It was just kind of this like, well, that's always wrong. In our culture, you know, no one said like in our culture we don't do that, but there was kind of this vibe of like, yeah, we don't. I don't know. Yeah, there just couldn't be. If that's what you mean by blinders, like there's no space for that nuance.
Maybe I wouldn't call it a blinder, but something that's morally unthinkable in a certain context. We won't allow ourselves to think about something in a certain way. And so like I'm not a big fan of, you know, like corporal punishment myself, and so I don't know necessarily all the arguments that are made for that, but I could imagine that some people are trying to make certain arguments with that. I might not agree with it, but if that gets shot down, then those concerns aren't able to emerge and be taken into the conversation. So basically, it's like a part of the elephant becomes cut off and separated from the whole in a certain way. Does anybody else have an example where something like this happened to them, where they observed something like this?
I've spoken with someone that has like aphantasia, and I have like an inability to actually emphasize with that. You know, which is the like they have, which is like a sort of disability where they can't visualize something.
Mhm.
So like so it's the inability to actually visualize something. So if you tell them like, hey, picture a triangle, that doesn't compute, right?
Okay.
And so that's like a completely different worldview where I can't even like begin to understand how
Yeah.
and so when you sort of superimpose that on like a
Mhm.
value system, like I
Mhm.
value liberty or something,
Mhm.
it sort of works in the same way where it's like I can't picture what it's like to not have, like, you know, some people have inner monologues or whatever. Like some people are, there's actually a portion of the population that don't have like inner monologues. Like they don't have a voice in their head. They just think, or you know, and that to me is like inconceivable. Like I don't know how that works. Like I pre-hawk cannot conceive of it.
Mhm.
And so it much in the same vein as like a, you know, I think that this policy would work and this policy shouldn't work and we should do this. It's much in the same way.
Yeah.
It's like phenomenological in nature.
Perfect. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Like you can't picture a different world. Sometimes you can't imagine something different. And so there's just something that like if you're one of these like blind people, you know, if they've never seen a tusk before and somebody's telling you that no, like there's this thing called a tusk, you know, like it's here, it's shaped this way. If you walk into it, you know, it's gonna hurt you. If you have no knowledge of that, you can't imagine it. Angeli.
Yeah, sort of related can also be so past experiences that prevent them from seeing something any other way, like then one specific way. So if it's like I have friends who have dealt with a lot of trauma in their past. And so coming into a situation that's free of actual threats, they still perceive threats as being there because they've just had so many things happen to them that they're anticipating harmful things in places where there isn't harm. And so that can become a kind of blinder from seeing something good or not harmful because there's this like trauma in the way.
Yeah, and trauma, this is actually something really like there's a whole field that's dedicated to like trauma and this kind of thing because like you just need a complete different set of tools to engage with this. And in like the field of like conflict studies, especially when we're talking about war or how do you rebuild societies like after war, there are like particular like specialists who have to go in. And there's lots of people who don't have that training and sometimes they make things worse because they're telling people there's no danger, but it doesn't matter if the danger is factual. If you feel it, you get triggered and you go into that fast thinking. Greg.
Yeah, I think sometimes problems arise when people like lack shared definitions for concepts or ideas or words, even things like that. Or when they're debating things and they're coming at it from, they might be debating things and they're debating within different contexts. Like somebody might be talking within a North American context and somebody else is speaking within a European one, and they haven't really established that before they begin discussing those things. And then before you know it, the conversation is running away from you in a fraught way before that's really established.
Yeah, so like a good metaphor that I like is like talking about different dialects in the sense that we just use language in different ways, or we're talking about different contexts. And so it's definitely huge. David.
A kind of blinder I've encountered is someone not conceiving that they could be wrong. Yeah, it's always something that needs to be sorted out if we're going to make progress.
For me, I often wonder if it's very connected to the triggers as well. Like there's something else that's also kind of going on underneath, because maybe if they're wrong, they might feel like they're in danger, right? Or if they're wrong, there's something else at stake. If they're wrong, then that means that maybe they're not who they think they are. This kind of stuff. And so this also goes into what Angela was mentioning earlier about identity, which is something we'll talk a little bit more about in just a second, actually. So thanks guys for these. If you want to list more, feel free to put them into the chat. And we're going to continue. So a lot of the research and a lot of the discussions that are around what to do in this kind of way is about how do you take off these blinders. And more importantly, how do you switch from system 1 to system 2 thinking? So if people are triggered, if people are feeling threatened, all these different kinds of things, like what can you do within a moment to create space to kind of like help that person, help that group step back, or make them feel safe enough to engage with that. So when we were talking about some of these different techniques in some of these other workshops that we had, all of these different techniques are basically about that. How to go from fast thinking to slow thinking. How do we kind of slow down and take things in? Like, I'll open up the blinders, allow in more nuance. I want to just mention though that this isn't going to help in all circumstances, because sometimes there actually is a threat. You know, maybe there's some extenuating circumstance, or people are in some kind of financial and medical trouble. So what I'm talking about more here are these cultural and political and social reasons why we feel triggered. Sometimes there are actually people, like armies of trolls and bots, who are like trying to make this kind of conflict happen. This isn't going to help in that case. So I don't want to say this is the only strategy and this is the only factor, but this is kind of what I want to be talking about today. So okay, so that was point number 1. There's lots of stuff going on under the hood. There might be different kinds of thinking. People get triggered. There are consequences to that. People freeze up. People put on their blinders, and all of a sudden, this very complex, nuanced case becomes a very simplistic, black and white, right, wrong, and we're in that mode. So that's the first point that we're talking about here. The second point is that there are lots of unconscious reasons to get triggered that are not immediately obvious. And so actually, Angela was brought the spoilers, because we're actually going to be talking about 2 factors with that: identity and values. And I'm focusing on these right now because there's been a lot of interesting research about this in recent years that I found particularly helpful, and that I think are kind of important to talking about some of these factors today. Some of you guys might have heard of these before. Let me know if you have any additional thoughts or anything to add to this. So the first one I talk about is identity. So there is, ever since kind of the end of the Cold War, at least in this kind of conflict study stuff, like people have been really focusing on these identity conflicts, often about religious identity, about ethnic identity. We saw wars like in Rwanda, we saw Bosnia, we saw different groups being pitted up against each other. Where people were being mobilized because they thought not just that themselves, but their group identity was under threat. And so there's been a lot of kind of theorizing since then about why are people acting in this way? Like, if we think about, for example, the 9/11 attacks in New York, why is an American in Texas feeling attacked by a terrorist's action that happened like half the nation away? So what a lot of these researchers have been talking about is that there's a need, like a deep-seated need for belonging, that's not only individual, but it's collective. And that when we form a large group identity, if we feel that some other group that's a different group is attacking a member of our group or attacking some fundamental tenet of our group, then we might feel like we're being threatened. And so we see this about, like, for example, religious differences. If somebody attacks our religious beliefs, or if we're a political party, like if somebody's attacking like liberals or conservatives, like these are things that we might feel personally attacked. This is normal, and this is something that I found really interesting about the way that people approach this, because again, this can be something that's dismissed as, oh, this is something irrational, this shouldn't be an issue. This is how there's an argument that's that this is how we evolved in order to kind of survive as groups, to kind of like band together and to keep going. And so it's like, this isn't something, this is us. This isn't something that's bad that we have to like get rid of. It's like, this is just a dynamic that has to be managed, in the same way that if I don't have food, I'm like, for a very long time, like I'm going to start acting out, and in the same way, if we don't have this secure sense of group identity, people start acting out. So the question is less than, okay, how do I stop this person from feeling attacked? But okay, so in what way is this group feeling threatened? And what can I do, if that's what I want to do, to how do you say it? Like, to kind of make that feeling of threat diminish. So another thing that's interesting, there's a great book called uncivil agreement, how politics became our identity. So this political science named a scientist named Liliana Mason, she kind of summarized a lot of the research on something called sorting. And this is something that kind of happened, especially in the United States, but also in Canada to a certain extent. You have all of these different identity markers, these large group identity markers. And over between the 60s and the 90s, what they noticed was that a lot of these groups, whereas in the past, somebody might kind of belong to one group, to another group, to another group, they noticed something called sorting, which is where certain groups started banding together into different kind of like bigger teams. And so the teams basically that have been identified, this is something I actually want to look more into because I'm not sure why these groups in particular, but this is a finding that's been repeated again and again, that sometimes like these groups seem to be coalescing into these large group identities. So in the States, for example, with a lot of the dynamics that happened with the election of Trump, like that was something that a lot of people kind of like identified as a trigger moment where different people kind of formed into camps and started attacking each other. And so what the research says about sorting is that when these groups start becoming more homogenous, and these groups start kind of ganging up on each other in these teams, when one identity is being threatened, all of them start being threatened. And that raises the stakes and the sense of existential threat even more. And one thing that people also mention is feeling of humiliation. If, for example, these identities are kind of more spread out, if one identity kind of feels attacked, then you might have these other ones to fall back on. But as each kind of like group becomes more socially homogenous, the humiliation of one kind of comes with the humiliation of others. And so some of the results that they've been saying have been happening with this is that there's more polarization, the stakes are higher, and there's interesting kind of like alliances. So for example, during the Trump era, we've been seeing something that people have been finding very interesting is that the memes that are being used by, for example, Christian groups and by kind of white supremacist groups, there's overlap, even though these are groups that are like kind of like their ideologies are against each other. Like a lot of the memes that are being used between them were similar. So you're getting this kind of cross-pollination that creates some of these problems. This is like a really big kind of like issue. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it today, but basically just like the takeaway is that not only are individual identities being threatened, but like a lot of identities at once are being threatened. Not everybody is completely sorted, but the stakes do feel bigger. So again, less contact between people with different views, dehumanization a lot more from the other side. Again, this kind of big team loss where like the entire team might be kind of in an insecure position. And so there's actually more of a motivation to win and to have victory over the other side. And again, the humiliation feels more. And so this adds this extra cognitive barrier to seeing the other side in a more nuanced light, especially when it's kind of seen as zero sum, because kind of giving in to the other side in one way might put a lot of other things at risk for you. So again, yeah, this kind of teaming up, we already kind of talked about this, these kinds of strange alliances. Have you noticed anything actually, like different groups that are kind of cooperating in ways that seem strange?
I think, like you said, during the election, you would see like alt-right groups and religious groups at the same rallies for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, religious. Danilo?
I think I've heard that, I don't want to make any assumptions here, but I think I've heard that like the Black community and I guess the BLM community like mixes with socialist movements and Marxist movements.
Yep, that's one that's been identified quite concretely. And BLM is actually a really interesting example of that kind of intersection in terms of the discourse that they use. Somebody's in the chat. Conservatives and pro-nuclear power. That's interesting.
I was going to say kind of conservatives and classical liberals, like Dave Rubin and Catholic Bishop talking.
I'm actually going to say like libertarians and conservatives.
Yeah. This is actually one that I found, like, this is something that I think is like also quite interesting, because before, like when I was younger, at least, the narrative was that like conservatives and libertarians were enemies. But then after a certain while, like the sorting changed. And it seems like whereas before it was kind of like the liberals and libertarians were together and the conservatives were on the other side, the libertarians kind of like shifted over as the kind of battle lines changed. Although this is definitely up for debate.
One other one I notice is someone had brought up the vegetarianism or veganism before, and like natural health people and anti-vaxxers are also sort of making alliances.
How do you even spell anti-vaxxer?
That's it. That looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah. So so these kinds of like strange alliances, there are some theorists that say this is an issue, like this is a consequence of sorting. Somebody else in the chat. Active encouragement of intersectional approaches. Could you speak to that a bit, Angela, what you mean by that?
I think there's a lot of people talking about lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying that if like you have lived experience as a woman experiencing violence, like that's different from say Black person experiencing structural racism. But then when you experience both, that puts like a whole different lived experience yet again.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't lived that, then you can't understand it. But
mm-hmm.
there seems to be sort of I guess a politics to encourage people to see things at least in politically multidimensional forms of
Mm-hmm.
difficulty, oppression, so that you don't have sort of the classic feminist problem where they only like see their own issue and nothing else and become quite oppressive towards others.
Yeah, I think this is actually a really good point in terms of like the discourse around intersectionality, because this is also something that some people are mentioning in terms of the sorting, like issues like Black issues, like women's issues, LGBT, also eco issues. A lot of people are starting to talk about these in the same discourse and in similar ways, and kind of like banding together to talk about justice. And so that's actually like it's a bit different than like what you're mentioning, like the intersectionality, but like also there's this element where like these different groups that have been perceived as traditionally marginalized are coming together to try to use their experience of marginalization to support each other. And so that's definitely another kind of element of that. So again, this isn't like not everybody is kind of sorted into these neat groups. So you have, for example, like different kinds of mixes of these, but like those mixes are getting fewer and fewer. And with those points of contact between those groups are getting fewer and fewer. And with this less contact, there are people who are also saying there's like a greater chance for dehumanization, because there's less space to encounter each other as a nuanced human being that you can have that's in a relationship with you. So in short, yeah, like there's this element of we want our team to win and or be secure, and people can be blinded as to important data on the other side. So for example, why do you feel threatened? Why do I feel threatened? Like why is this grievance from this group also triggering this grievance from this group? And so these are all the kinds of factors that are going on under the surface. So if we say something like, oh, like I think that Black Lives Matter, somebody might explode. And that might not mean that they don't think like that they have a certain opinion on racism, but it's like it's because they're these teams and they perceive that team as something that's threatening. And you could talk about that in terms of racial issues, about religious issues. It's something that feels like a landmine that's hard to navigate. Joanne is asking if pandemic isolation may be exacerbating this, less points of contact than even before. I'd be interested if people do research on that. Like that sounds like something that could resonate, but I don't know. That would be very interesting to track. So again, things that we can do in the face of this, like building contact, building relationships. Something that's mentioned is cross-cutting cleavages. So they did some studies of different towns in the States, and they noted that like these counties that were less vulnerable to this kind of polarizing rhetoric, these were towns and these were counties that had a lot more of these small scale institutions where people from different groups could meet each other and build relationships with each other. So things like legions, sports teams, churches, breakfast clubs, like things like that. When there are more amounts of these kinds of places to meet, other than these ideologically charged places to meet, people are more resilient to this kind of polarizing triggers, basically. And that's something I find very interesting. But in terms of what we can do as people, it's about, okay, so why do I talk to certain people and not to others? Why do I build relationships with some people and not to others? And if you're seeing people team up, especially if it's people on, on your side or people on the other side, thinking about, oh, like are people feeling threatened in that way? Somebody wrote something in the chat. Greg, can you speak to your point maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I just noticed a trend for these popular acronyms to be used, like BIPOC and BAME in the UK is a popular one, which sort of group different identity groups together into larger groups.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain the acronyms for those of us who might not know?
Oh yeah, BIPOC is, I think, Black, Indigenous, Person of Color. So it's like multiple racial identities, I guess. And BAME is Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, I think, in the UK. So that's a similar one where it groups different racial identities into one larger group, as in giving a sense that they're all on one sort of side of maybe a larger sorting of two groups or something.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and also like that actually reminds me, there's one thing to say about this kind of teaming up is that there are also benefits to this. Like, for example, if we're talking about this kind of intersectionality, this kind of like different racial groups that feel marginalized coming together to fight for either for their rights or for kind of a change in social attitudes, this is something that can really help. But it comes at the cost of creating these polarizing situations where people feel triggered and kind of locked down into this fast sort of thinking. So I don't want to talk, like there's not, I don't want to talk for too much longer, but there's another element of the values. I just want to actually put that over there. So there's something called moral foundations theory, which I know a bunch of you have already talked about. So this is a theory that was developed by a social psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, popularized in a book called The Righteous Mind. And they were doing some research that kind of focused on the ways that different groups of people kind of rally around different kinds of they call them moral foundations. So they identified a few. So some of the famous ones here are care or harm. So are we hurting somebody? What's the morality behind preventing harm from somebody? Another of one of these foundations, like freedom, versus oppression, like how free are people? Another one's like fair and unfairness, loyalty, betrayal, purity and desecration, authority, subversion. And so different groups are perceived to have a different sensitivity to different values and to prioritize them in different ways. So this is a very famous theory. Like a part of me is kind of like is a little suspicious because it seems almost a little too convenient in some ways, but it's held out over time, and I think it's a good metaphor in terms like when we're thinking about, okay, so why do some things trigger people and not others? So when we're talking about these kind of political identities, the team that's developed this theory, they identified that liberals, conservatives, and libertarians actually value different values more than others. So they said that liberals focus primarily on care and harm and freedom and oppression above the others, with a bit more of, with a little bit of kind of this fairness, unfairness. But these kinds of values of like making sure that you're loyal, authority, that things are pure, those might be kind of like less emphasized over time. Libertarians are said to emphasize freedom most of all. And so when we're thinking about, okay, so thinking about like this kind of contemporary divide where libertarians are said to have migrated over from teamed up with liberals to teamed up with conservatives. Some people are saying that this is because of the focus now on justice and the focus now on harm, where there's such a focus on which groups are being marginalized, which groups are facing problems, which groups are being discriminated against. And this is something that's kind of like a rallying cry for certain groups. But for certain libertarian groups, the emphasis on freedom, either freedom of speech or autonomy, these kinds of issues. And so that can kind of create these conflicts when we talk about some of these issues, right? Because when we think about safe spaces, are we creating a space where people feel safe? Or are we creating a space where people can express themselves freely in a way that might be harmful to somebody? So which value are we elevating more over the other? So there's a whole book about this that if you find this kind of interesting, you can read that. We don't have too much time to get too much into this, but like basically people are talking about there's these discrepancies between values, and these discrepancies create these conflicts as well. So he also, one finding that was quite sensational from this book is this research. They said the conservatives actually kind of value all of these in kind of in a more equal way. So these kinds of care and freedom concerns might be tempered by chains of authority, by being loyal to a certain, within a certain structure. Some people call this purity, some people call it cleanliness in a certain way. So again, this is a bit of a controversial claim, but sorry?
Sorry.
Who is that?
Sorry, I was more talking to myself, but the like purity and ethnic cleansing and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Which I mean can be also the extreme alt-right kind of stuff.
And this is something that people have been looking at for a long time in terms of ethnic violence. Like when this very high polarization, there's this emphasis to cleanse, not like sometimes actual people in terms of pushing them out or even killing them, but also do we want to cleanse our spaces of certain ideas? And this is actually one thing that's in the book and in this research, they kind of focus it, like kind of associate this with kind of the more right and the conservatives. But today also, when we're talking about intersectionality, when we're talking about justice, there can also be this emphasis to clean our spaces of things that we think are dangerous, of dangerous like influences or of things that might be affecting people. So all these different groups like use these values in different ways. I don't know to what extent this value, like different groups valuing is like, I don't know how much this holds water, but I think that each, like different groups, whether we're talking like liberal, conservative, but if we're talking about any of the groups that we mentioned up here, they might think of these values in different ways, right? So what is the purity that needs to be taken, right? Is it a purity of ideas, keeping pure from dangerous ideas, or is it, for example, talking about immigrants, So it's a very different, these are basically just things that might also prompt these unconscious when people are unconsciously triggered by something. So here we are over here. Are there any questions about this or anybody who wants to call bullshit?
I will emphasize as well, it's not limiting to these foundations, and that they're not limited to those. I believe the author has also said that it's mostly about explanatory power than it is about saying these are the only ones that exist and that these can change and that the results can change given like a sort of cultural dynamic change or whatnot. And so I think he added a sixth foundation like 2 years ago or something.
Yep, that was the freedom oppression one that he added. Originally there were the 5, but again, this is a way of thinking about why are people triggered by certain values and what do they how do they express these different kind of moral functions, and how might these prompt people to get into conflict with others. And another element of this is if you're in a group that publicly espouses certain values, sometimes you want to be seen as having these values because this is also an issue of belonging, or of rejection, or of perceived rejection. So what are the things that we might not see if we have different values? Have you ever had, again, kind of going back to this metaphor of the elephant, and kind of seeing, have you ever kind of seen a situation where it seems like somebody really focuses on one value to the exclusion of some other ones, and this kind of causing conflict around the issues that we were talking about before?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Like I think, like for example, on the abortion debate, so someone who is more conservative maybe values the authority of what the Bible has to say about it, or like what they think the Bible has to say about it, whereas someone on the other side might care more about the person's well-being. I guess like the care versus harm value, and so they just see two completely different things.
Mhm. Yeah. Also, if we're talking about the abortion debate, the care harm function might also be used very differently. There might be one side that emphasizes the care of the woman, and one side that emphasizes care of the fetus. And again, when these values are also very connected to our identities, because there might be kind of like worldviews that are kind of attached to the groups that we belong to, and if somebody is attacking one of our values, then this might also come as an attack to our group, and it might kind of trigger these very hostile responses to the other. So in short, okay, Sharon, yep, go ahead.
I think the one that bothers me the most is like pro-life voters who vote for candidates because they say they're pro-life, but then in every other action or policy, they don't care about the lives that are already there.
Mm-hmm. And how would you, like, how does that play into the kind of the social conflict that kind of comes around here?
Well, it just seems like such a, it seems so in the face of what they're trying to do. They're trying to protect lives.
Mm-hmm.
So they vote for this person who says they're pro-life. That doesn't
Yep.
actually change any legislation, but then also like takes babies away from their parents. Like it's just in every other policy, they are obviously not caring about the lives of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard this like that, like when people are talking about this, one way I've heard people speak about it is that there might be some cases where people are voting pro-life out of a sense, possibly out of loyalty or authority, rather than kind of out of a sense of care.
Yeah,
and that's one way that I've heard that kind of being spoken about.
It's like it's the exclusionary thing. That's all they're voting on. They're not looking at any of the other issues that also affect life.
Yeah, and Danil?
I just thought of another example potentially, which is cancel culture.
Yep.
Like that, the idea is, I think it's a higher focus on care and harm. So they want to create such high consequences, or I don't know. It's like they care so much about the claim that they don't want to even risk questioning someone who's telling the truth when they're making a claim about harassment or abuse. So they're heavily focused on care and harm, to the exclusion of things like due process and maybe fairness or equal like treatment of.
Yeah, and so like also one way that that's framed is a conflict between freedom and care, in terms of like, do we have freedom to say certain things or to post about certain things, and to what extent should those freedoms be curbed by, for example, regulation, because For some people, it might actually be dangerous or cause harm. Definitely. Greg.
Yeah, I mean, that one might also fall along the loyalty betrayal aspects in some ways, like loyalty to a certain orthodoxy amongst a group. And when somebody steps outside of that, then there's a need to either discipline them in some way to bring them back into the group or to cancel them for a lack of loyalty.
Definitely. And again, these are all very kind of relevant dynamics to a lot of the debates over these issues that we mentioned above. So to kind of sum up, a lot of these fights, especially about either like these core values or these very controversial topics, might often be because people are being triggered. And so if we're observing some kind of fight or some kind of conflict, either within our communities or within our families, or if we're kind of embroiled in something, something that might help us try to figure out, okay, like what's at stake, like what's happening, like and also what can we do about it? We might try to think about, okay, is somebody being triggered here? And again, when we're saying triggered, it's not about is somebody being irrational, or is somebody being stupid, or is somebody being wrong. It's about, does somebody think that something important is at stake? Does someone feel the need to defend themselves? So are they being triggered? And is that triggering because an identity is coming under threat? Or because some kind of value is being challenged? A different value. So is somebody placing their values over the other one's values? And these are things that are being really kind of emphasized right now when we're talking about these kinds of culture war battles. And these are things that can really kind of inspire these hostile responses. And so sometimes if we're getting a very strange response, it might be because there's all this stuff is happening down here under the iceberg. So when we're asking about why are people fighting about politics, religion, and these other hot topics, are people being triggered? Is there a legitimate reason why people are being triggered? And is that being kind of amplified by these different cultural dynamics that are happening around us? So that's kind of the end of the formal presentation. Does anybody have any questions or any comments? Like this was kind of like this is kind of information heavy. But Danilo, is that a hand? Okay, great. Angela.
Yeah, like I haven't, this is just sort of brainstorm, but I'm wondering how all this relates to the kind of like sort of codification of behaviors that I think like over time people have devised, right? So that we have forms of politeness. So like you should be polite, like you don't yell in most situations. There's like Robert's rules or Robert's rules and others that's how you structure debate in parliaments or in formal situations. So like these kind of behavioral codes that are then supposed to be these helpful straitjackets to facilitate discussion. How does that relate to all this?
So that is an example of where was it? Yeah, so that's an example of like people using a technique to try to switch from system 1 to system 2 thinking, this kind of going from this fast thinking to slow thinking. If we have kind of like a very regulated way of speaking, of talking, then we may not be as reactionary. We'll have time to think about things. We might have space to engage that more deliberative thinking. However, one thing that's really interesting right now is that when we're talking, there's kind of this new discourse right now, especially when we're talking about these controversial topics, where those dynamics and these techniques, this is being called like, it's often framed in terms of civility. We need to be civil, we need to discuss with each other, but there's actually right now kind of this this discourse that's saying we need to stop being civil. We need to fight, we need to protect, we need to, there's one discourse that's saying that civility sometimes is used to stifle voices, to stifle marginalized groups by telling them to calm down. And so we have actually this this very interesting moment right now where civility is being disparaged, especially if you're trying to fight for the rights of a certain group. And so for some people, civility is a way to go from this kind of slow, fast thinking to slow thinking. But for other people, civility is being, and these Robert's rules are being framed as a way to basically maintain an oppressive power structure and keep certain people down. And so that's a very interesting debate that's happening right now.
I feel like it's kind of happening on the streets as well as like in conversations where now it's there's kind of a loyalty aspect to that too. Like I remember whenever the BLM riots were really bad last year, kind of seeing people on social media being critiqued for even like questioning whether vandalism could really be a helpful way to achieve something, or kind of like if there was really a legitimate argument for it. That so almost like appeals to civility on the streets too, I think, are also kind of coming under fire more.
Yep. And there's actually an interesting kind of thing where some observers are wondering if civility and what we'll call resistance are also elements that are being sorted into some of these groups, especially during the Trump era. We had this kind of discourse that's like that kind of framed being civil is for one side, and that needs to be resisted, and that's something a little bit different. And but there's that conversation that's happening. Yes. So Amir, yeah.
Yeah, to sort of bring on like civility in system 1 and system 2 sort of reminds me of like some of the justice system decisions. Like, you know, like there'll be cases of someone like self-defense and perhaps exhibiting too much harm in a self-defense situation. Like, you know, someone has the, and to sort of pronounce like, oh yeah, you should have been civil enough to exact the required amount of harm to defend yourself. I know in Canada, we have sort of really strange self-defense laws. But sometimes I think back to those cases and I'm like how they're all in system 1, they're not in system 2 when you're in like those fight or flight situations. And so there's a certain degree of uncharitable requirement given to people sometimes where we sort of pretend like we're in system 2 all the time when people tend to either dismiss or ignore system 1 in many respects, or almost see it as like barbaric or something.
Yeah, and that's this kind of like this like in conflict studies also I've seen this kind of like emphasizing system 2 over system 1, where like civility is good, like deliberation is good, this kind of things. But for example, the civil rights movement, you know, and like Gandhi and things like this, these were also acts of resistance that tried to kind of like change certain systems, right? And so like there's like different people kind of support both in depending on their goals, you know. And another element of this kind of self-defense thing that you're kind of speaking to, discourse, especially a few years ago, like when people were talking about whether or not we should punch Nazis, and kind of defending oneself against groups that we find threatening. And so this is also kind of like.
Well, another example is like, you know, when you're getting pulled over by a cop, you know, you're probably scared shitless, right? And so like to presume, you know, when people sort of look at a video of an event that happened, everyone's sort of in their armchair and thinking to themselves like, man, they should have done this, and, you know, consulted their moral calculator. But you know, it's life's not that simple. And, you know, to enact judgment because someone didn't use system 2 is sort of something that is frighteningly common as we have access from the world down with the internet.
Yeah. Thanks, Amir. We have a couple other hands up. Matt.
Like, I think you're talking about nuance here, like with system 1 and system 2, because in a world where only system 1 reigned, you'd have things like where the group with the most power just gets what they want because they can. Like, if you don't appeal to people's sense of like fairness and like the slower deliberation, you won't have progress, I think. And I'm also wondering how things like if, and I don't know if I'm like getting into conflict territory here, but like with things like Black Lives Matter, like some of the critiques are that it's hard to empathize with the other group if you're not a part of it, or it's hard to see your own privilege. And I'm like looking at the list of the moral foundation theory dichotomies, and it's like none of those things kind of address kind of like biases that we might have, like invisible biases that maybe should be interrogated, but like you don't necessarily have to. And I wonder if that might be failing of, I don't know, because
yeah, I think that and this is just like my perspective on this, it's like I think that all of these work as tools in a toolbox, and that different lenses are kind of applied in different situations. So when we're thinking about like unconscious bias and how does that affect our perceptions, we can look at that. We can also look at how we're motivated by triggers. We can look at how we're motivated by values. We can think about how we're motivated by our group loyalties, our identities. And so today I think it's more like there's all sorts of different factors that we can talk about. Like I guess we're limited to a couple ones today, like this identity and values and this kind of like triggering mechanism. But there's lots that can be said about everything that you mentioned, how bias affects our ability to perceive. And this is actually another kind of blinder that doesn't let us see the whole story, especially when we're talking about discrimination, because we might not see the need for example, a protest if we're not on the receiving end of certain attitudes. We still kind of have a group activity that I'm hoping that we will have time to do. So just a couple quick questions. Danilo.
I'll try to be quick. Just a practical question. I often find myself trying to have like trying to conduct system 2 type analysis on difficult topics. And I will notice when someone I'm talking to is kind of going into system 1. And I'm wondering if there's a way I can speak so that they understand that I get the urgency, but I'm just trying to stay composed, or if I should just leave those conversations. I have found recently that it's been great when I just leave and then try to come back another time or whatever.
Yeah, like again, I like for some people, it's also a matter of visibility, like making somebody feel visible in the way that they feel threatened, right? So it's like if somebody feels like you're threatening them, maybe asking their story, you know, like speaking and also kind of repeating what they're telling you, saying, oh, like, are you feeling this because of this? Like, is this something that's important to you? Sometimes that also helps to de-escalate the situation. That's actually the core of this technique that we mentioned. We had a workshop on it the other month called nonviolent communication. And that's like a very structured kind of way to speak in situations like that, to try to de-escalate and to kind of, show the person that you're on their side. There's also a great book and lots of great articles about that, but there's lots of techniques if you're interested in that, but also just, you know, like taking a break or saying, I'm sorry. Like I think helping other people feel visible and framing things in a collaborative way can be really helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Amanda also mentions watching a guy named Joseph Grenny. I'm not sure who he is. He's on YouTube, so YouTubers. You guys can also kind of like share other links if there are certain things that that you find helpful. Also something else in the chat. Crucial Conversations is a book that he had. Amanda says in the chat. Great. Also, one book that I found really helpful is called How to Have Impossible Conversations. It's by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay. And this is basically a book full of like techniques. Basically, it's a bit extreme, but like it's like sometimes it's like not practical. It's just like 40 techniques how to do this, and it's like, but it's if you want to know more about how some people have done it, that can be helpful.
That's awesome.
Right. Great. So thanks, Lisa, for coming. See you again soon. So she dropped out. So again, these factors and paying attention to these factors are not going to help in all situations. When there are interest groups, for example, that are trying to push for their own cause, social media also is optimized to trigger and to promote these kinds of responses. Also, there might be influencers, for example, like bloggers, public figures, cultural, religious leaders, group leaders that are basically trying to kind of push the direction into a more of a fast thinking kind of style. And so when there's actually these kinds of structural issues that are pushing people in this direction, taking a look at these things might not be as helpful. Sometimes you need to look at, okay, is there actually somebody pushing it in this direction? But people will be more responsive to this kind of manipulation if they're feeling threatened and if they have reason to feel threatened. And so thinking about the people in our lives, our friends, our communities, if they feel insecure, if they're feeling triggered, trying to approach that and address that might be a step in a helpful direction. So we have a small activity right now. We're going to divide into groups, and you're going to discuss in your groups. You're going to imagine your other. So when I mean your other, it's like think about the values and the identities and the things that trigger you. I want you guys to think about who's your opposite, who reacts in a different way, who interprets or sees things in a certain way. And it would be great if you can kind of like answer some concrete questions, like what do they do? Like, what are their actions and how are they different than yours? How do they interpret issues? What motivates them? What triggers them? What's at stake for them? And I encourage you guys, if sometimes when people do an exercise like this, it's like, imagine your other. Oh, like my other is a stupid person who believes stupid things. That if I would try to be more concrete. So it's like, okay, so I believe that we should be dialoguing with each other. I believe that this. So my other would be somebody who thinks that maybe resistance is more important in more situations. My other might be somebody who thinks that talk is cheap, you know? So I encourage you guys, when you're making these lists, not so much to have judgments or value, kind of value of evaluations, I guess, but just to be very concrete. What is it that makes them different? And yeah, try to think maybe together in a group. What is it that might motivate this person to act and react in these conflict situations in a different way than you? So Joanne, perfect, thank you. So we're going to go into groups right now. I'm gonna, and maybe we'll have, what do you guys think? Is 15 minutes long enough, or would you guys prefer 20 to have a discussion about this kind of stuff? I think, what do you think?
I'm just confused, Josh.
Yeah.
Are we choosing one other group or other value system as a group, or are we assigned something?
Oh, like so if there's groups of like 3 or 4 people, like everybody just kind of talks about who their other is. Think about a person, you know, like who's like kind of the opposite of you, of somebody who's the opposite of what you believe in, and how you react to things, and kind of brainstorm together. Okay, so what might motivate this person to think in this certain way? How might their reactions be legitimate? So it's more of kind of a brainstorming and discussion section. Joanne asked to give us 20, but if it's slow, we can come back. I'm actually not sure if there's this function. Can people kind of jump back to the main room if they're finished themselves, or do they have to be let back in?
I think they're able to leave. I think they're able to leave their group, and then once they leave the group, it automatically routes them back to the main.
Okay, perfect. That's with the exit button in the corner.
I believe so. I've only done it a couple times, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, if they exit, it takes them back here.
Great. So yeah, so maybe let's have 20 minutes for this discussion. If you guys are finished, you can
just
either.
To clarify, don't exit. You click leave and then you say like leave the breakout room instead of leave the meeting.
Yes.
Or else everyone will go home.
Leave the breakout room, not leave the whole. Like if you want to leave the whole event, that's your choice. I won't you know, I won't take it personally. I might get triggered, but I'll survive. But yeah. So also, if you guys feel like you're done, you can also message me. I'll be going between the different rooms. And if you need some help, then we can also then I can also help out. So does anybody have any questions about the task? No? Okay, great. So I'm going to put you guys 20 minutes. Sorry, my computer's a little bit slow. Oh wait, sorry, I pressed the wrong thing. I need to. Okay. There we go. Okay. So you guys are going to go into your groups, and I will see you soon.
For me, it's like, I think quite the opposite, that we have to focus on returning to socializing